Have you ever worked beside someone for years, feeling invisible, only to discover they noticed every single detail about you? That moment when the carefully built walls come crashing down can change everything. Let me know in the comments what state you're watching from, and whether you've ever experienced that electric moment when professional boundaries suddenly shifted. Isabel Chun had perfected the art of being invisible. In 3 years of working as executive assistant to Dominic Torino, she had mastered the precise balance of competence and obscurity that kept her employed and unnoticed. She arrived each morning at exactly 7:45, placed his espresso on the corner of his desk where he preferred it, organized his schedule with military precision, and managed his communications with the efficiency of someone who understood that in his world, mistakes could cost more than just a job. She had learned not to look too long when he rolled up his sleeves during late meetings, revealing the intricate tattoos that marked him as what he was. She had trained herself not to notice the way his dark eyes tracked her movements across his office, or how his jaw tightened whenever other men spoke to her. She definitely had learned not to think about the way his voice dropped to that rough whisper when he was angry, or how his hands moved with lethal grace whether he was signing documents or reaching for his gun. Isabel was very good at not noticing things about Dominic Torino. The problem was that Dominic Torino was even better at noticing everything about her. He noticed that she took her coffee black with exactly 1 sugar cube, never 2. He noticed that she unconsciously tucked her dark hair behind her left ear when she was concentrating, and that she wore the same small silver earrings every day except Fridays, when she switched to tiny pearl studs. He noticed that she stayed late without being asked when he had difficult meetings, somehow knowing he would need her calm efficiency to manage the aftermath. What Dominic had been trying very hard not to notice for 3 years was how perfectly she fit in his space, how her quiet competence settled something restless in his chest, and how dangerous it would be for both of them if he ever acknowledged what had been growing in the silence between them. He had hired her after she had handled a crisis situation with remarkable composure. A rival family had attempted to disrupt one of his legitimate business meetings by having the building evacuated for a bomb threat. While his previous assistant had panicked and fled, Isabel had calmly contacted his security team, relocated the meeting to a backup location, and ensured that all contracts were signed without his clients ever knowing there had been a problem. She had been 26, thin, sharp, and determined, with the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving things she never talked about. He had kept her at a distance ever since, maintaining the fiction that she was simply an employee, that her presence in his life was purely professional. It was safer for her that way. Women who got too close to him tended to become targets, and Isabel Chun was far too valuable to lose to the violence that followed him like a shadow. But 3 years of careful distance was about to shatter in the space of a single conversation. Marco Benedetti slouched into Dominic's office that Tuesday afternoon with the casual arrogance of a man who had been family since childhood. As Dominic's second-in-command, Marco had access few others enjoyed, which made his next words all the more problematic. "Your secretary," Marco said, dropping into the leather chair across from Dominic's desk. "She seeing anyone?" Dominic's hand stilled on the contract he was reviewing. The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, dangerous and impossible to take back. He looked up slowly, meeting Marco's expectant gaze with the kind of stillness that usually made smart men reconsider their choices. "What did you say?" Marco seemed oblivious to the warning in Dominic's voice. "The brunette out there. Isabel. She's been here, 3 years? Never seen her with anyone. Figured I'd ask if she's available before I made a move." The word move echoed in Dominic's head like a death sentence. Every instinct he possessed, every protective urge he had spent years suppressing, rose to the surface with volcanic force. The idea of Marco's hands on Isabel, of anyone's hands on her, filled him with a rage so pure it felt like religious experience. "No." The word came out flat, final, carrying the kind of authority that ended conversations and sometimes ended lives. Marco raised an eyebrow. "No, she's not available? Or no, you don't know? No, you will not touch her. No, you will not speak to her about anything that isn't business. No, you will not so much as look at her the wrong way." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Marco sat up straighter, finally recognizing the danger he had stumbled into. His eyes darted between Dominic's face and the door, calculating distances and possibilities. Boss, I didn't know, now you do. Marco nodded quickly. Understood. Completely understood. Get out. Marco left with the speed of a man who valued his continued breathing, but the damage was already done. 3 years of careful restraint had cracked like thin ice, and Dominic could feel everything he had been holding back threatening to pour through the fissures. From her desk in the outer office, Isabel had heard every word. She sat frozen, her fingers hovering over her keyboard, as the implications of what she had witnessed crashed over her. Dominic had just claimed her with the kind of possessive fury she had only seen him direct at business rivals and territorial threats. The man who had barely looked at her directly in 3 years had just made it clear that she belonged to him in some fundamental way she was only beginning to understand. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she heard Marco's hurried exit, followed by the heavy silence from Dominic's office. She knew she should pretend she hadn't heard anything, should return to her typing and maintain the professional facade they had both worked so hard to preserve. Instead, she found herself standing and walking toward his door. She knocked once softly. Come in. His voice was rough, strained with emotions she had never heard from him before. She stepped into his office and closed the door behind her, noting how his dark eyes tracked her movement with predatory focus. Mr. Torino, she began, then stopped. 3 years of careful formality suddenly felt ridiculous in light of what had just happened. Dominic stood slowly, his tall frame unfolding with the kind of controlled grace that reminded her exactly how dangerous he was. At 6'3", with the broad shoulders and lean strength of a man who had built his empire with his hands as much as his mind, he commanded space in a way that made her feel both protected and threatened. You heard. It wasn't a question. They both knew she had excellent hearing and that his office walls weren't soundproof. Yes. And the question hung between them, loaded with 3 years of unspoken tension and carefully ignored attraction. Isabel felt as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that her next words would either pull her back to safety or send her tumbling into something that would change everything. And I think we need to talk. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the careful control he maintained. For just a moment, she saw the man beneath the boss, the one who had been watching her with hungry eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. Yes, he said quietly. I think we do. The admission felt like a door opening, like the first step across a line they could never uncross. Isabel Chun was about to discover that being invisible had been the easy part. Being seen by Dominic Torino was going to change everything. Isabel spent the rest of that Tuesday afternoon in a state of hyper-awareness that made her feel as if her skin was too tight for her body. Every sound from Dominic's office made her pulse jump. Every time he emerged from meetings or phone calls, she felt his eyes on her with an intensity that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had always been there, and she had simply trained herself not to notice. 3 years. 3 years of arriving early and staying late, of managing his schedule and protecting his time, of being the invisible woman who kept his professional life running smoothly. She had convinced herself that she was content with invisibility, that the steady paycheck and the strange security of working for someone powerful enough to keep the world's chaos at bay was enough. She had told herself that the flutter in her stomach when he walked into a room was simple admiration for his competence, that the way she noticed everything about him was merely professional attention to detail. She had been lying to herself for 3 years. The truth was that Dominic Torino had gotten under her skin from the very first day, when she had walked into his office for an interview and felt something shift in the air between them. She remembered that morning with crystalline clarity now that she was finally allowing herself to examine it. He had been younger then, 32 to her 26, but already carrying himself with the kind of authority that came from surviving things most people only saw in movies. The interview had been interrupted by chaos. A bomb threat had forced the evacuation of the building where he was supposed to sign a critical merger agreement. His previous assistant had abandoned her post, fleeing with the other evacuees and leaving him without backup during a crisis that could have cost him millions. Isabel had stayed. More than that, she had taken charge. She had contacted his security team, researched backup locations, and within 40 minutes had relocated the entire meeting to a conference room in a sister building 6 blocks away. She had ensured that contracts were signed, lawyers were coordinated, and the merger proceeded without his business partners ever knowing there had been a disruption. When the bomb threat turned out to be false, orchestrated by a rival family trying to derail his legitimate business expansion, Dominic had looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You're hired," he had said simply. "But there are rules." The rules had been clear. Professional distance. No personal questions. No involvement in the family business beyond managing his legitimate enterprises. She would be well compensated for her discretion and her competence, but she would remain exactly what her job title suggested, an assistant. Nothing more. Isabel had agreed because she needed the job and the fresh start it represented. She had agreed because working for someone with Dominic Torino's reputation meant a level of protection she couldn't afford any other way. She had agreed because something in his dark eyes suggested he understood what it was like to need safety more than comfort. What she hadn't anticipated was how difficult it would be to maintain professional distance from a man who noticed everything. Dominic observed people the way a predator studied prey, cataloging weaknesses and strengths with the kind of attention that made her feel simultaneously exposed and protected. He noticed that she favored her right ankle after long days, evidence of an old injury she never discussed. He noticed that she grew quiet and tense whenever certain names appeared in his correspondence, men whose reputations preceded them in the worst possible ways. He noticed everything, and somehow managed to make her feel safer because of his attention rather than threatened by it. The irony was that in trying to protect her by maintaining distance, he had made himself irresistible to her. A man powerful enough to destroy lives who chose gentleness when speaking to her. A man who commanded respect through fear, who made sure she had fresh coffee and lunch breaks, even during crisis meetings. A man whose business required ruthless decision-making, who had somehow created a pocket of calm professionalism where she could exist without looking over her shoulder. But now that careful distance was cracking, and Isabel wasn't sure whether to be terrified or thrilled by what might emerge from the ruins. The intercom buzzed at 6:30, well past normal business hours. "Isabel," she heard through the speaker. His voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the strain underneath. "Can you stay late tonight? I have calls to make." "Of course," she replied, as she had dozens of times before. But this time felt different. This time, staying late meant being alone with him, while the new awareness between them hummed in the air like electricity before a storm. She ordered dinner for both of them without being asked, the way she always did during long evenings. Chinese from the place on 5th Street that he preferred, extra vegetables, no MSG. When the delivery arrived, she brought his portion to his office and found him standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, his phone pressed to his ear. "No," he was saying, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made smart people reconsider their life choices. "That's unacceptable. My territory includes everything from the harbor to Maple Street. The Castellanos know this. If they want to expand their operations, they can do it somewhere else." Isabel set his dinner on the small table near his desk and turned to leave, but his free hand caught her wrist gently, asking her to stay without words. The touch sent electricity up her arm and straight to her chest, making her breath catch. His skin was warm and slightly rough, and she could feel the strength in his fingers even though his grip was careful not to hurt her. "I understand that business disputes can be resolved through negotiation," Dominic continued into the phone, his thumb unconsciously stroking across the pulse point at her wrist. "But some people mistake patience for weakness. That would be unfortunate for everyone involved." He released her wrist and ended the call, but the warmth of his touch lingered like a brand. When he turned to face her, his dark eyes were troubled in a way she had never seen before. "Thank you for the dinner," he said quietly, "and for staying. It's my job." The words came out automatically, the safe response she had given hundreds of times before. But something flickered in his expression, a flash of what might have been disappointment or frustration. "Is it?" he asked. "Just your job?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Isabel felt her carefully constructed professional persona wavering under the intensity of his gaze. She could lie, could retreat back to the safety of their established dynamic, could pretend that the conversation with Marco hadn't changed anything between them. Instead, she heard herself asking, "Should I be worried about whatever that phone call was about?" Dominic went very still. For a moment, she thought he might deflect, might retreat behind the polite fiction that his legitimate businesses were all she needed to know about. Then his shoulders straightened with what looked like a decision. Possibly, he said quietly. The Castellanos have been pushing boundaries for months, testing our responses. Tonight, they moved product through territory that's been ours for 15 years. Territory. Product. The careful euphemisms didn't disguise what they were really discussing. Isabel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She had always known what Dominic was, what his family did, but hearing it acknowledged directly was different from willful ignorance. What does that mean? For me, it means that you should be careful. It means that staying late alone in this office might not be as safe as it used to be. It means that the distance I've maintained between us was about more than just professional boundaries. The admission hit her like a physical blow. All these years, she had thought his careful politeness was indifference. Instead, it had been protection. He had been shielding her from the dangers of his world by keeping her at arm's length, and she had interpreted his consideration as rejection. Dominic, she began, then stopped. Using his first name felt like crossing another line, but hiding behind formality suddenly seemed ridiculous. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the exhaustion in his eyes that he hid from everyone else. Isabel, what happened today with Marco? It was bound to happen eventually. I can't keep pretending that you're just an employee. Not when every instinct I have screams that you're mine to protect. The possessive declaration should have frightened her. Instead, it sent warmth cascading through her chest, settling low in her belly with honeyed heat. She had spent 3 years craving exactly this kind of acknowledgement, this proof that she mattered to him beyond her professional capabilities. But with the acknowledgement came danger, and they both knew it. Should I be worried? She asked again, needing to understand exactly what she was walking into. Dominic's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. Yes, he said simply. But not tonight. Tonight, you're safe here with me. 2 hours later, when the last of Dominic's calls had ended and the city lights stretched endlessly beyond his office windows, Isabel realized that everything between them had fundamentally shifted. The careful professional boundaries they had maintained for 3 years lay in ruins around them, and neither seemed inclined to rebuild them. I'm driving you home tonight, Dominic said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. The Castellanos situation requires precautions. Isabel looked up from packing her purse, noting the way he had already put on his suit jacket and collected his keys. In 3 years, he had never driven her anywhere. She had arrived and departed on her own, maintaining the fiction that her life outside his office was separate from his concerns. That's not necessary, she said automatically, even as part of her wondered what it would be like to sit beside him in the intimate space of his car. I can take the subway. His dark eyes flashed with something that might have been frustration or amusement. Isabel, the subway runs through Castellano territory. After tonight's conversation, you're no longer just an employee who happens to work in this building. You're someone they might use to send me a message. The words sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the realization that she was stepping into his world in a way that would change everything. Being under Dominic Torino's protection meant accepting both the safety and the danger that came with belonging to him. 20 minutes later, she found herself in the passenger seat of his black Mercedes, hyper-aware of every detail. The car smelled like expensive leather and his cologne. Classical music played softly from speakers that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His hands on the steering wheel were steady and confident, the same hands she had watched sign documents and gesture during phone calls, now navigating the city streets with the kind of casual expertise that spoke of someone comfortable with power. Tell me about your apartment, he said as they stopped at a red light. The building, the security, your neighbors. It was a reasonable request given the circumstances, but something in his tone suggested this was about more than just professional security assessment. This was about him learning the details of her life, mapping the space where she existed when she wasn't in his orbit. 6th floor walk-up in Brooklyn, she said. No doorman, but the building's secure enough. I've lived there for 2 years. Most of my neighbors are young professionals, a few families. Nothing unusual. What about before that? The question was casual, but Isabel heard the underlying curiosity. For 3 years, he had known nothing about her life beyond her work capabilities. Now he was collecting details, filling in the gaps in his knowledge of who she was when she wasn't being his perfectly efficient assistant. A different apartment, she said carefully. In Queens. I moved after I decided I needed a fresh start. Something in her tone made him glance at her, his dark eyes assessing. The fresh start that led you to working for me? Yes. He didn't push, but she could feel his attention like a physical weight. Dominic Torino hadn't built his empire by ignoring important details, and she was beginning to understand that everything about her had become important to him in ways that went far beyond professional necessity. When they reached her building, Dominic parked and got out of the car before she could protest. He walked her to the front door, his presence transforming the familiar space into something that felt simultaneously safer and more dangerous. She had never brought a man to her apartment, certainly never someone who commanded the kind of attention Dominic did simply by existing. As she fumbled for her keys, his hand covered hers, stilling her movements. Isabel. She looked up to find his face serious, his dark eyes holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. What is it? He was staring at the building's entrance, but she could tell his attention was focused on something she couldn't see. The windows, he said quietly. 3rd and 5th floors. Do you know anyone in those apartments? She followed his gaze, confusion mixing with the first threads of genuine fear. No, why? Because someone's been watching this building. See the way the curtains are positioned? The angle gives a clear view of the front entrance and your building's lobby. Professional surveillance. The words hit her like cold water. Professional surveillance meant this wasn't random. Someone had been specifically watching for her, learning her patterns, documenting her movements. The safety she had built over 2 years of careful anonymity was an illusion. We're not going up to your apartment, Dominic said, his voice carrying absolute authority. You're coming home with me. Tonight. Home with him. The words created images in her mind that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with the way he had been looking at her since Marco's ill-advised question that afternoon. Home meant his space, his bed, his life outside the careful confines of the office where they both knew how to behave. Dominic, I can't just— Yes, you can. You're going to get back in the car, and we're going to discuss this somewhere that isn't under surveillance. You can argue with me all you want once you're safe. The drive to his penthouse passed in tense silence, Isabel's mind racing through the implications of what was happening. Someone was watching her. Someone connected to the Castellanos, most likely, which meant her presence in Dominic's life had made her a target. The careful distance he had maintained for 3 years hadn't been enough to protect her from the reality of what he was. His penthouse occupied the top floor of a building in Manhattan that screamed wealth and power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the city that made her feel as if she was floating above the chaos below. The furniture was modern and expensive, all clean lines and neutral colors that somehow managed to be warm rather than cold. Everything about the space reflected the man who lived here, controlled, sophisticated, and slightly dangerous. Drink? He asked, moving to a bar cart that probably held liquor worth more than she made in a month. Please. He poured 2 glasses of something amber and expensive, handing her one before settling into the chair across from her. The domestic normalcy of the moment felt surreal given the circumstances that had brought her here. How long has this been your home? She asked, needing to fill the silence with something other than the awareness humming between them. 5 years. I bought it after some personal complications made my previous living situation untenable. Personal complications. More euphemisms for the violence and danger that shaped his world. Isabel sipped her drink, feeling the warmth spread through her chest as she tried to process the reality of being in his private space. Tell me about the fresh start, Dominic said quietly. The one that brought you to my office 3 years ago. The request hung in the air between them, loaded with 3 years of professional distance and the new intimacy of her presence in his home. She could deflect, could maintain the privacy she had protected so carefully, or she could trust him with the truth. I had a job in marketing for a small firm in Queens, she said finally. Good work, decent pay, normal life. I was engaged to someone I thought I knew. Michael Chun. We'd been together for 2 years. Had been engaged. Past tense. Dominic's dark eyes tracked every micro-expression on her face. Reading the story, she wasn't quite telling. What happened? Michael had some financial problems. Gambling debts, it turned out. He'd been hiding it for months, making payments to people who didn't accept late fees or excuses. When he couldn't pay anymore, they came after me. The words came easier than she had expected, maybe because Dominic was watching her with the kind of attention that suggested her story mattered to him beyond mere curiosity. Maybe because sitting in his penthouse, protected by his wealth and power, made the past feel less threatening than it had in years. They wanted me to convince him to pay up by making me an object lesson. Broke into my apartment, left photos of me going to work, coming home, having coffee with friends. Messages about what would happen if Michael didn't settle his debts. I realized that the man I was going to marry had made me a target for people who hurt others for a living. Dominic's knuckles went white around his glass. What did you do? I left. Broke the engagement, quit my job, moved to a different apartment under a different name. I'd saved enough money to start over if I was careful. The job with you was supposed to be temporary, just until I could rebuild my career. But working for you meant a level of protection I couldn't get anywhere else, even if you weren't offering it intentionally. And Michael? She met his eyes directly, letting him see the steel that had gotten her through the worst period of her life. I never saw him again. As far as I know, his debts were his own problem after I disappeared. Dominic set down his glass and moved to the couch beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Isabel, he said, his voice rough with emotions she was only beginning to recognize. You've been running from dangerous men, and you ended up working for the most dangerous man in the city. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had fled from one kind of violence only to find herself drawn to another. But there was a crucial difference that she was only now allowing herself to acknowledge. The difference is that you would never use me to hurt someone else, she said quietly. You would never make me a target to solve your own problems. No, he agreed, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with devastating gentleness. I would burn down half the city before I let anyone hurt you. The declaration should have frightened her. Instead, it sent warmth cascading through her chest, settling in her bones like coming home. She had spent years protecting herself, building walls, and maintaining distance to stay safe. But sitting here with Dominic, seeing the fierce protectiveness in his dark eyes, she realized that some kinds of safety were worth the risk. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and she found herself leaning into the touch. This is why I kept my distance, he said softly. This is why I tried to pretend you were just an employee. Because once I acknowledged what you mean to me, there would be no going back. What do I mean to you? The question came out as barely a whisper, but in the quiet of his penthouse, it sounded like a shout. Dominic's eyes darkened, his thumb stilling against her skin as he searched her face for something she hoped he would find. Everything, he said simply. You mean everything? The confession hung in the air between them, 3 years of careful restraint finally cracking under the weight of honesty. Isabel felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling, revealing the want she had been hiding even from herself. Dominic leaned closer, his free hand settling at the curve of her waist, and she could see the exact moment when his control finally snapped. He kissed her with the desperation of a man who had been denying himself something essential, his mouth warm and demanding against hers. She kissed him back with 3 years of suppressed longing, her hands fisting in the expensive fabric of his shirt as she pulled him closer. He tasted like whiskey and promises, like safety and danger wrapped together in a combination that made her head spin. The sound of his phone ringing shattered the moment like gunfire. Dominic pulled away with a curse, his eyes wild and his breathing ragged. The caller ID showed one of his security contacts, and his expression shifted immediately from desire to deadly focus. What? He answered, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. Isabel watched his face change as he listened, saw the moment when whatever he was hearing transformed him from the man who had just kissed her into the dangerous stranger who commanded an empire built on violence. When? How many? Are they still there? The one-sided conversation sent ice through her veins. She didn't need to hear the other side to understand that something had happened, something that concerned both of them. Understood, Dominic said finally. Double the security on the building and send me everything you have in an hour. He ended the call and looked at her with eyes gone cold and calculating. The Castellanos hit your apartment building 20 minutes ago, he said quietly. They're looking for you. The words hit her like a physical blow. While she had been kissing him, while she had been falling into the safety of his arms, someone had been hunting her. The careful life she had built was gone, destroyed by forces she barely understood. What does that mean? It means you're staying here, under my protection, until this is resolved. It means that as of tonight, Isabel Chun belongs to me in every way that matters. The possessive declaration should have terrified her. Instead, looking into his dark eyes and seeing the fierce protectiveness there, she felt something settle into place in her chest. Something that felt like coming home. Yes, she said quietly. I am. The next 3 days passed in a surreal bubble of domesticity and danger. Isabel found herself living in Dominic's penthouse, sharing his space in ways that felt both natural and impossibly intimate. He worked from home, conducting business from his study while she managed his correspondence from the dining room table that had been transformed into a temporary office. The arrangement should have felt awkward, but instead it revealed how seamlessly their professional partnership translated into personal compatibility. On Sunday morning, Dominic found her standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows with her coffee, watching the city wake up far below. You're coming to dinner today, he said without preamble. My mother expects to meet you. The statement was delivered with the casual authority she had grown accustomed to, but Isabel heard the underlying significance. In 3 years of working for him, she had never heard him mention bringing anyone to family dinners. Dominic, I'm not sure that's. My mother is Teresa Torino, he interrupted gently. She raised 4 children in this business, and she has very specific opinions about the women we bring around the family table. If you're going to be under my protection, she needs to meet you. The implication sent warmth through her chest. This wasn't just about temporary safety measures. This was about integration into his world in a way that would make their relationship real to the people who mattered most to him. 3 hours later, Isabel found herself in the passenger seat of his Mercedes again, this time heading toward a brownstone in Little Italy that looked deceptively modest from the street. The neighborhood carried weight, the kind of quiet respect that came from generations of families who understood power and discretion. Nervous? Dominic asked, noting the way her hands fidgeted with her purse strap. Should I be? His smile was warm and genuine, transforming his face in ways that made her breath catch. My mother is going to love you. She's been waiting years for me to bring someone home who isn't terrified of her. The Torino family home was exactly what Isabel had expected and nothing like what she had imagined. Warm and lived in, with photographs covering every available surface and the smell of garlic and oregano filling the air. Teresa Torino was a small, elegant woman in her late 60s with silver hair and sharp dark eyes that missed nothing. She embraced Isabel warmly before stepping back to study her with frank assessment. So you're the one who's been keeping my son organized all these years, Teresa said, her voice carrying the faint accent of someone who had learned English as a second language. He talks about your efficiency constantly. Isabel glanced at Dominic, surprised. He talks about me? Teresa's laugh was rich and knowing. Child, he mentions your name more than he realizes. Always Isabel organized this. Isabel handled that. Isabel anticipated the problem before it became a crisis. I was beginning to think this mysterious assistant was too good to be true. The dinner table was crowded with family. Dominic's 2 younger brothers, Antonio and Luca, both in their late 20s and clearly cut from the same genetic cloth as their older brother. His sister Sophia, 31 with 2 young children who treated their Uncle Dominic like a combination jungle gym and personal bodyguard. The conversation flowed easily around traditional Italian dishes that tasted like love and comfort. You know, Teresa said during the main course, Dominic has never brought a woman to Sunday dinner before. Ma, Dominic warned, but his tone held affection rather than real annoyance. What? It's true. 35 years old, and this is the first time he's thought someone was important enough to share with his family. The revelation sent warmth cascading through Isabel's chest. She was the first. After all his years of careful distance and professional relationships, she was the first woman he had considered worthy of his mother's assessment. As the evening progressed, Isabel found herself relaxing into the warmth of family acceptance. Teresa told stories about Dominic as a child, always protective of his younger siblings, always taking responsibility for others' safety. The picture that emerged was of a man who had learned early that protecting the people he cared about was both duty and identity. He was 12 when his father was killed, Teresa said quietly when the conversation turned more serious. Suddenly, he was the man of the house, responsible for all of us. Some children would have crumbled under that pressure. Dominic thrived. The words painted a picture of trauma transformed into strength, of a boy who had channeled loss into an unbreakable need to shield others from the dangers he understood all too intimately. Isabel began to understand why he had fought so hard to keep her at professional distance. Caring about people, for Dominic, meant accepting responsibility for their safety in a world where that responsibility could cost everything. After dinner, when the family had settled into comfortable conversation in the living room, Dominic drew her aside to a quiet corner where they could speak privately. "There's something else I need to tell you about the situation we're dealing with," he said, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to his family. "Marco brought me intelligence this morning. The Castellanos aren't just testing territorial boundaries. They've been hired." "Hired? By whom?" "Michael Chun." The name hit her like ice water. Michael, who she hadn't seen or heard from in 3 years. Michael, whose gambling debts had made her a target before she had fled to rebuild her life in safety and anonymity. "That's impossible," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. She had never told Dominic the complete truth about Michael, had never shared the parts of that relationship that still woke her up with nightmares. Dominic's eyes were watching her face with uncomfortable intensity. "Isabel, I need you to tell me everything. All of it. Because the man who hired professional muscle to track down an ex-girlfriend he hasn't seen in 3 years isn't someone motivated by lingering affection." The careful control she had maintained crumbled under the weight of his attention and the implications of what he had just told her. She had spent 3 years believing she was safe, that distance and time had protected her from the worst parts of her past. Instead, Michael had been hunting her, patient and methodical, using resources that suggested his situation had changed dramatically since she had left him. He wasn't just gambling, she said quietly. The debts weren't just financial. Michael had other problems. Control problems. Dominic went very still beside her, his body radiating the kind of tension that preceded violence. "What kind of control problems?" "He liked to know where I was every minute of every day. Who I talked to, what I said, what I was thinking. At first, I thought it was romantic. Protective. Then it became suffocating. Then it became frightening." The words came slowly, dragging themselves from the part of her memory she had tried to bury. Michael had been charming initially, attentive in ways that had made her feel cherished. The transition to possessive had been gradual, almost imperceptible until she had found herself isolated from friends and family, accountable for every moment of her time. When I tried to pull back, to reclaim some independence, he escalated. Showed up at my work. Followed me when I went out with friends. Called constantly. When I finally told him I needed space, he made it clear that wasn't an option he was willing to accept. Dominic's hand found hers, his fingers interlacing with her own in a gesture that felt like both comfort and claiming. "Did he hurt you?" "Not physically. Not until the end. But he hurt me in other ways. Made me doubt my own perceptions, my own judgment. Made me feel like I was crazy for wanting basic privacy and autonomy." The admission felt like bleeding out years of carefully protected shame. She had never talked about the psychological aspects of Michael's control, the way he had systematically eroded her confidence and independence until leaving him had felt like the most terrifying thing she had ever done. What happened at the end? He came to my apartment one night after I'd told him I was done. Forced his way inside. Said if he couldn't have me, he'd make sure no one else could either. That's when I saw who he really was underneath all the charm and concern. That's when I realized I was in real danger. Dominic's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking gently across her skin in a gesture so different from Michael's possessive touches that it made her chest ache with relief. "Isabel," he said quietly, "why didn't you go to the police?" Because Michael was smart. Careful. He never left marks, never made threats in writing. It would have been his word against mine. And he was a respected businessman with connections and money. I was nobody. You were never nobody, Dominic said fiercely. You were never expendable or disposable or unworthy of protection. The declaration broke something loose in her chest, 3 years of carefully guarded emotions spilling over like a dam bursting. She had spent so long believing that leaving had been cowardice, that accepting Michael's treatment had been weakness. But looking into Dominic's dark eyes and seeing the fury there on her behalf, She began to understand that survival had required more strength than she had ever given herself credit for. "He's found me," she said, the reality of the situation finally settling in completely. "After 3 years, he's tracked me down." "Yes, and according to Marco's sources, he's not the same man you left. The gambling was just the beginning. He's connected now. Dangerous in ways he wasn't before." "Connected to whom?" "People who make the Castellanos look like amateur hour. People who have resources and reach that extend far beyond anything you dealt with 3 years ago." The implications sent terror cascading through her system. Michael hadn't just been hunting her. He had been building the kind of power and connections that would make her disappearance permanent and untraceable. Dominic pulled her closer, his arms coming around her in a gesture that felt like fortress walls rising between her and the dangers gathering in the darkness beyond his family's living room. "But he made one critical mistake," Dominic said quietly. "He threatened someone under my protection. That makes this personal." The possessive declaration should have reminded her of Michael's controlling behavior. Instead, it felt like salvation. Dominic's protection came with choices. He had asked her to stay, had given her options, had respected her autonomy even while keeping her safe. Michael's version of protection had been a cage designed to keep her isolated and dependent. "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done the moment he made you a target," Dominic replied, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made smart people disappear. "I'm going to eliminate the threat." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that transformed the comfortable family gathering into something much more dangerous. Isabel understood that she was witnessing the moment when Dominic Torino, the protective boyfriend, became Dominic Torino, the man who built his empire on decisive action and strategic violence. Looking into his dark eyes, seeing the fierce determination there, she realized that she wasn't afraid. She was grateful. For 3 years, she had protected herself through careful anonymity and constant vigilance. Now she had someone willing and capable of ensuring her safety permanently. "When we go home tonight," Dominic said quietly, "everything changes. No more professional distance. No more pretending you're just an employee. If you're going to be mine, Isabel, you need to understand what that means." The question and promise in his words sent heat spiraling through her system. She had spent 3 years wanting exactly this kind of claim from him, this acknowledgement that she belonged in his life in ways that went far beyond professional necessity. "I understand," she whispered. "Do you? Because there's no going back from this. Once you're truly mine, I'll never let you go." The declaration echoed Michael's possessive threats, but the context transformed the meaning completely. Michael's version of never letting go had been about control and isolation. Dominic's was about protection and partnership, about choosing to bind their lives together because the alternative was unthinkable. "Good," she said simply, "because I don't want to go anywhere." That night, when they returned to his penthouse, Dominic made love to her with the reverence of a man worshipping something precious and the passion of someone claiming what was rightfully his. He touched her like she was both fragile and strong, like she was something worth protecting and worth possessing in equal measure. Afterwards, as they lay tangled together in his bed with the city lights painting patterns on the ceiling, Isabel felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble completely. She belonged to him now, in all the ways that mattered, and for the first time in years, the future felt like something to anticipate rather than fear. But in the morning, Marco would arrive with intelligence that would transform their newfound happiness into a race against time, and the dangerous game Michael had been playing would finally demand a reckoning that would test everything they had built together. The attack came on Thursday afternoon, precisely when Isabel had finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, possibly, they could build something lasting together without the past destroying it. She was alone in Dominic's office, reviewing contracts while he attended a meeting across the city, when Marco burst through the doors with an expression that made her blood turn to ice. "They're in the building," he said without preamble. 3 men, professional, armed. They made it past lobby security somehow. Dominic's 20 minutes away. The words hit her like physical blows. After days of careful security measures and strategic planning, Michael had found a way to reach her in the one place she had felt completely safe. The office that had been her sanctuary for 3 years was about to become a battlefield. "Where?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Stairs and elevator." They're moving fast, and they know exactly where to find you. This isn't random, Isabel. They've been studying the building layout. Marco was already moving, his phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with Dominic's security team. But Isabel could do the math. Professional kidnappers who had breached a building with excellent security weren't going to be stopped by anything short of overwhelming force, and Dominic's men were scattered across the city managing other business. How long do we have? Minutes. Maybe less. The elevator dinged in the distance, and Marco's expression went flat and deadly. He drew his gun with practiced efficiency, the casual gesture transforming him from Dominic's charming second-in-command into someone who killed people for a living. Bathroom, he said quietly. Lock the door. Don't come out until you hear Dominic's voice or mine. Isabel moved toward the small bathroom attached to Dominic's office, but something in Marco's posture told her they were already too late. The men hunting her weren't amateurs who would be deterred by locked doors and hidden targets. They had come prepared for resistance. The office door exploded inward with the force of professional breaching tools. 3 men in dark clothing moved with military precision, covering angles and eliminating escape routes with the kind of coordination that spoke of extensive planning. The man in the lead was tall and lean, with the kind of predatory focus that made Isabel's skin crawl with recognition. She knew him. Michael's new business partner, someone she had seen photographs of but never met. Someone whose reputation preceded him in the worst possible ways. Marco fired twice, fast and accurate, but he was outnumbered and outpositioned. The brief firefight was brutal and decisive, ending with Marco on the ground and the 3 intruders advancing on Isabel with the casual confidence of professionals completing a routine job. Miss Chun, the lead man said politely. Mr. Chun has been very eager to see you again. I'm sure you understand. The words were delivered with the kind of mannered courtesy that made the threat even more terrifying. This wasn't personal for them. She was simply an objective to be acquired and delivered, her fears and autonomy irrelevant to their professional concerns. Hands behind your back, please. We'd prefer to do this without additional unpleasantness, but we're prepared for resistance if necessary. Isabel backed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, her mind racing through possibilities that all ended with her disappearing forever. Michael had spent 3 years building the kind of power and connections that would make her vanish without a trace. Even if Dominic moved heaven and earth to find her, some disappearances were permanent. The sound of multiple vehicles arriving outside made everyone in the room freeze. Through the windows, Isabel could see black SUVs surrounding the building with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of overwhelming force deployment. Car doors slammed like gunshots, and she caught glimpses of armed figures moving with military efficiency toward the building entrances. Dominic had arrived, and he hadn't come alone. The lead kidnapper's radio crackled with panicked voices reporting that their escape routes were blocked and that they were surrounded by superior firepower. The professional calm cracked slightly as he realized their extraction plan had become impossible. Change of plans, he said into his radio. We're moving to Contingency 3. Tell Mr. Chun the timeline just accelerated. Contingency 3 apparently involved using Isabel as a human shield while fighting their way to the roof, where a helicopter extraction was supposedly waiting. The plan might have worked against normal security forces or even most criminal organizations. But Dominic Torino didn't operate by normal rules, and the men he employed weren't constrained by legal considerations or concern for collateral damage. The office door, already damaged from the initial breach, disintegrated completely under controlled explosive charges that sent the kidnappers scrambling for cover. Through the smoke and debris, Isabel saw Dominic moving with lethal grace, flanked by 6 men who cleared the room with the kind of overwhelming violence that ended resistance before it could properly form. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds. When the gunfire stopped, 2 of the kidnappers were dead, and the third was on his knees with his hands zip-tied behind his back. Dominic stood in the center of his ruined office, his expensive suit torn and bloodied, his dark eyes scanning for threats with predatory focus. When his gaze found Isabel pressed against the windows, something shifted in his expression. The dangerous stranger who had just eliminated 3 armed professionals with casual efficiency transformed back into the man who had made love to her with desperate tenderness just hours before. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice rough with emotions she was only beginning to recognize. No. Marco's alive. Wounded, but stable. My men are getting him medical attention. Dominic moved toward her slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening, as if he understood that witnessing his capacity for violence might have changed how she saw him. The careful approach broke something loose in her chest, because even in the aftermath of deadly force, he was thinking about her comfort and emotional state. She ran to him instead, throwing herself into his arms with the desperation of someone who had just realized how close she had come to losing everything that mattered. He caught her against his chest, one hand cradling her head while the other pressed her closer, and she could feel the tremor in his hands that revealed how terrified he had been. "I'm okay," she whispered against his neck. "I'm okay because of you. You're never going to be in danger like this again," he said fiercely. "I promise you that. Michael Chin's war against you ends today." The surviving kidnapper was conscious and cooperative, providing intelligence that confirmed what they had already suspected. Michael had built connections with people who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. The kidnapping attempt had been phase one of a plan that would have ended with Isabel's death and the destruction of any evidence linking Michael to her disappearance. But Michael had made a crucial miscalculation. He had assumed that Dominic's protection extended only to professional courtesy, that threatening someone's employee was different from threatening someone's family. The difference between those two categories, Isabel was learning, was measured in the survival rates of people who crossed certain lines. 2 hours later, she found herself in a private medical facility that specialized in treating people whose injuries couldn't be explained to traditional hospitals. The cut on her arm from flying glass was minor, but Dominic insisted on having it properly cleaned and bandaged by someone who understood discretion. "You realize what this means, don't you?" she asked as a medical technician applied sterile dressings with professional efficiency. "What we've crossed into." Dominic sat beside her hospital bed, his hand warm and steady in hers, his dark eyes holding her gaze with uncomfortable intensity. "It means that you've seen exactly who I am and what I'm capable of. It means that you know the kind of violence that protects the life we're building together." The words hung between them like a test, like a final opportunity for her to reconsider her choices before they became irreversible. She had witnessed him orchestrate the kind of ruthless efficiency that left 3 men dead and another broken, had seen the cold calculation that transformed him from lover to lethal weapon in the space of heartbeats. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt safer than she had in years. "I love you," she said simply. "Not despite who you are, but because of it. Because you're someone who would move heaven and earth to protect the people you care about. Because you're strong enough to keep me safe in a world where safety has to be taken by force." The confession broke something loose in his expression, 3 years of careful restraint finally crumbling under the weight of honesty. "I've been in love with you since the day you walked into my office and handled a crisis that should have destroyed everything I'd worked for. I've spent 3 years trying to protect you from this world, and you just chose to walk into it with your eyes wide open. Because I choose you," she said. "I choose this life with you, whatever it requires. I choose belonging to someone strong enough to eliminate the threats that would destroy lesser men." Dominic stood and moved to the small table beside her bed, retrieving something from his jacket pocket that made her breath catch in her throat. The ring was stunning, a classic solitaire that caught the hospital lights and threw rainbows across the sterile walls. "Then marry me," he said quietly. "Not because you need protection, but because I need you. Because 3 years of professional distance taught me that I can run an empire, but I can't build a life worth living without you in it." The proposal was everything she had dreamed of and nothing like what she had expected. No romantic restaurant or carefully orchestrated moment of perfection. Just a man who had just proved he would kill to protect her, asking her to bind her life to his permanently in the antiseptic quiet of a medical facility that specialized in treating violence. It was perfect. "Yes," she said, extending her hand so he could slide the ring onto her finger. "Yes to everything. Yes to marrying you. Yes to building a life together. Yes to being yours in every way that matters." The ring fit perfectly, which shouldn't have surprised her. Dominic Torino was someone who planned for every contingency, who gathered intelligence and prepared for possibilities months in advance. He had been ready for this moment, had been carrying the ring and waiting for the right time to transform their relationship from temporary protection into permanent partnership. When they returned to his penthouse that night, Isabel found that her belongings from her Brooklyn apartment had been moved into his space with the kind of seamless efficiency that spoke of professional movers and careful attention to detail. Her books were arranged on his shelves, her clothes hung beside his in the walk-in closet, her coffee mug sat beside his in the kitchen cabinet. She was home, completely and irrevocably, in the space they would share as husband and wife. Tomorrow, Dominic explained as they lay tangled together in bed with the city lights painting patterns on the ceiling, Marco would deliver intelligence about Michael's location and current associates. The threat that had haunted her for 3 years would be eliminated with the kind of permanent finality that came from crossing Dominic Torino's protective instincts. Tomorrow, the dangerous game that had started with gambling debts and escalated to kidnapping attempts would end with the kind of decisive action that removed problems rather than postponing them. But tonight, wrapped in the arms of the man who had just promised to love and protect her for the rest of their lives, Isabel finally understood what safety felt like. Not the careful anonymity she had built through distance and fear, but the active security that came from belonging to someone powerful enough to eliminate threats and gentle enough to handle her heart with reverent care. She was Dominic Torino's woman now, in all the ways that mattered, and the future stretched ahead of them like a promise she finally believed would be kept. 6 months later, Isabel stood in the same office where everything had changed, but nothing about her presence there was invisible anymore. The space had been rebuilt after the attack, all gleaming surfaces and reinforced security, but the most significant transformation wasn't architectural. It was the way every person who entered treated her with the kind of respect reserved for family rather than staff. "Mrs. Torino will see you now," she said into the phone, testing the weight of her married name with the same pleasure she had felt every day since their wedding 3 weeks ago. The caller's tone shifted immediately from casual courtesy to deferential attention. Being Dominic's wife had changed not just her legal status, but her position in the complex hierarchy of his world. Dominic emerged from his inner office as she ended the call, moving with the same controlled grace that had captivated her attention years ago. But now he crossed directly to her desk, his hand settling possessively at the curve of her waist as he leaned down to press a kiss to her temple. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly, the question carrying layers of meaning that had nothing to do with her general well-being. "Better," she replied, her hand moving unconsciously to rest against her still flat stomach. The morning sickness had been manageable so far, a small price to pay for the miracle growing inside her. "We're both doing well." The pregnancy had been a surprise, discovered just days before their wedding when fatigue and nausea had sent her to the doctor for what she had assumed was stress from planning the ceremony. Instead, she had learned that their life together was expanding in the most fundamental way possible. Dominic's reaction had been everything she could have hoped for. Pure joy followed immediately by protective instincts that made her previous experience of his security measures seem casual by comparison. He was going to be an extraordinary father, she realized, watching the way his entire expression softened whenever he looked at her now. Marco entered the office with his usual casual confidence, but the respectful nod he gave Isabel marked another significant change. The man who had once asked if she was available to date now treated her with the kind of careful deference reserved for the boss's most precious possessions. "Mrs. T," he said warmly, "you're glowing. Marriage agrees with you." "Thank you, Marco. How's the shoulder healing?" "Perfect. Your husband's doctor works miracles. I'll be back to full strength within the month." The easy familiarity between them reflected months of careful integration into Dominic's inner circle. She wasn't just the boss's wife who happened to be present during business discussions. She was a trusted advisor whose insights had proved invaluable and whose loyalty was absolute. "What do you have for us?" Dominic asked, his arm tightening slightly around Isabel's waist. "Michael Chen's associates have been eliminated," Marco reported with the casual efficiency of someone discussing routine maintenance. "The entire network has been dismantled. There are no remaining connections that could threaten Mrs. T or the family." The confirmation felt like a final door closing on the most dangerous chapter of her life. Michael's attempt to reclaim control over her had ended exactly as Dominic had promised, with permanent finality and no loose ends. She was free in ways she hadn't been since leaving Queens 3 years ago, protected not just by Dominic's love, but by the kind of decisive action that eliminated problems rather than postponing them. Excellent, Dominic said quietly. What else? The wedding photos came back from the photographer. They're spectacular. I took the liberty of having copies made for the family. Marco produced a leather portfolio that contained professional photographs of their ceremony, and Isabel felt her chest warm with remembered joy. The wedding had been perfect, a blend of intimate family gathering and respectful acknowledgement of Dominic's position in their community. Teresa Torino had cried during the ceremony, tears of happiness for a son who had finally found someone worthy of his fierce devotion. Antonio and Luca had stood as groomsmen with the kind of protective solidarity that marked her as family in the most fundamental way. Sophia had served as matron of honor, her children scattering flower petals with gleeful enthusiasm. But the most meaningful moment had been when Dominic's entire organization had stood as she walked down the aisle, a gesture of respect that acknowledged her not just as his bride, but as someone who would share his authority and influence going forward. The ceremony itself had taken place in the garden of the family home, surrounded by people who understood that some marriages were about more than personal happiness. This was a union that strengthened alliances and created new loyalties, that transformed a brilliant assistant into a partner whose wisdom would help guide important decisions. Look at this one, Dominic said, pointing to a photograph that captured them during their first dance. His hand was at the small of her back, her face tilted up toward his with complete trust and adoration. The image perfectly captured the transformation from professional distance to intimate partnership. You look like a woman who knows she's exactly where she belongs, Marco observed, and Isabel realized that was precisely what made the photograph so powerful. No uncertainty, no reservation, just the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. The afternoon brought a parade of meetings and phone calls. But unlike the old days when she had managed Dominic's schedule from a careful distance, now she participated directly in conversations that shaped their empire. Her insights into people and situations had proved remarkably accurate, and her ability to read between the lines of complex negotiations made her invaluable to decision-making processes. During a break between appointments, Dominic drew her aside to the small seating area near the windows where they had shared so many pivotal conversations. I have something for you, he said, producing a small velvet box that made her heart skip with anticipation. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a pendant that took her breath away, a small diamond surrounded by intricate metalwork that created the image of a protective embrace. It was beautiful and symbolic, a piece of jewelry that would mark her as his in subtle but unmistakable ways. It's perfect, she whispered as he fastened it around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. But what's the occasion? 6 months ago today, you asked me if you should be worried, he said quietly. 6 months ago, I finally stopped pretending that you were just an employee and started admitting that you were everything. The anniversary of their first real conversation, the moment when 3 years of careful distance had finally cracked under the weight of Marco's innocent question and Dominic's explosive response. Everything had changed that afternoon, transforming their professional relationship into something that would reshape both their lives completely. I love you, Mrs. Torino, he said, the formal address carrying playful affection rather than professional courtesy. I love you too, she replied, her hand finding his and interlacing their fingers in the gesture that had become second nature. And I love this life we've built together. As evening approached and the office began to empty, Isabel found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. 3 years ago, she had been running from a dangerous man who wanted to control and destroy her. Now she was married to a man whose power protected rather than threatened, whose love elevated rather than diminished her. The difference wasn't just in the men themselves, but in the fundamental nature of the relationships. Michael's version of love had been about possession and control, about making her smaller so he could feel larger. Dominic's love was about partnership and protection, about making her stronger because her strength reflected well on both of them. Ready to go home? Dominic asked, gathering his jacket and keys. Home. The word carried weight and warmth that had nothing to do with real estate and everything to do with the life they had built together. His penthouse had become their sanctuary, the place where they could be simply husband and wife rather than the powerful couple who commanded respect throughout the city. They drove through the evening traffic in comfortable silence, her hand resting in his while classical music played softly from speakers that had become familiar and comforting. Some things never changed, she realized. He still listened to the same composers, still drove with the same confident competence, still noticed everything happening around them with predatory awareness. But other things had transformed completely. Now his protective attention included her in ways that went far beyond professional courtesy. Now his careful planning incorporated her happiness and security as fundamental requirements. Now his future stretched ahead with the promise of children and grandchildren, of building something lasting together. That night, as they lay in bed with her head pillowed on his chest and his hand resting protectively over their growing child, Isabel felt the kind of peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. "You know what I realized today?" she said quietly, her fingers tracing patterns on his skin. "What's that?" "I spent 3 years thinking you barely noticed me. Turns out you were noticing everything." Dominic's laugh was warm and genuine, vibrating through his chest in ways that made her feel completely safe and cherished. "Cara mia, I noticed everything about you from the first day. The way you took your coffee, the way you organized files, the way you handled problems that would have destroyed other people. I noticed that you were brilliant and strong and absolutely devastating to my peace of mind. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I knew that once I acknowledged what you meant to me, there would be no going back. Because I knew that loving you would mean protecting you from dangers you couldn't even imagine. Because I was terrified that if I reached for you, I might destroy the one perfect thing in my life. And now? Now I know that some things are worth any risk. Now I know that protecting you means claiming you completely, not keeping you at distance. Now I know that the best way to keep you safe is to make sure everyone understands that you belong to me in every way that matters." The possessive declaration sent warmth cascading through her system, settling in her bones like coming home. She belonged to Dominic Torino completely and irrevocably, and he belonged to her with equal totality. They had built something together that was stronger than the sum of its parts, a partnership that would weather whatever storms their dangerous world might bring. As sleep began to claim her, Isabel thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago. Careful, invisible, protecting herself through distance and anonymity. Now she was protected through love and partnership, through belonging to someone powerful enough to eliminate threats and gentle enough to cherish her heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to build their empire together. But tonight, wrapped in the arms of the man who had transformed her from invisible assistant to beloved wife, she was exactly where she belonged. The future stretched ahead of them like a promise she finally believed would be kept, filled with the kind of happiness that came from being seen and valued and protected by someone who understood that some things were worth fighting for. Sometimes the most powerful love stories begin in the most ordinary places, hidden in plain sight until the right moment reveals what was always meant to be. Have you ever had a moment when someone's true feelings were revealed in an instant that changed everything? I'd love to hear about your own experiences with hidden attraction and patient love in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of Dominic and Isabel's journey from professional distance to passionate partnership, please subscribe for more tales of powerful men and the remarkable women who capture their hearts.